Satvika. Satvika, are you here?
That's fine. Yeah. Hi.
Yep,
Right.
we're here.
Great. Before we continue, can we just get you guys to quickly tell me your speaking positions and your preferred gender pronouns? Let's start with OG.
Yeah, Prime Minister is Harsha Vardhan Ray. He prefers he or him. My name is Karthik and I'm DPM. I prefer he or they.
OO.
Hi, I'm Alia. I'm the first speaker from O. I prefer she or they.
Hi, I'm Naira. DLO prefers she or they.
Monash.
Hi, PJ speaking first. No preference for gender pronouns.
Audrey speaking second, they please. Thank you.
Motion sickness.
Hi, I'm Faisal. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him. Speaking member.
Hi, I'm Ria. I'm going as GovWhip and I prefer the pronoun she.
Okay. All right.
Can we start
Thank
in
you very
10
much,
seconds?
everyone.
I'll connect another microphone. Give me 10 seconds.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's done. Thank you.
All right. Can we have Prime Minister here? Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me? I said. Actually, wait. Prime Minister, could you say something? Prime Minister, are you there? Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister, wait, Harsh. Harsh's video is on, but I'm not sure whether you're able to hear him.
Yeah, actually, just switch back to the mic that you had. Your previous mic was fine.
Harsh, use your previous mic. Yeah, I think he can hear us, but I'm not sure whether we can hear him. No, it's not.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, audio, I think.
Yeah,
You guys
now
can hear me, right?
yeah, I can.
Okay.
Is the judge able to hear adjudicator?
Sorry, yes?
Harsh, if you could say something just to confirm.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? You guys can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Right? Okay, amazing.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Cool. Second. Okay, starting. Okay, cool. Okay, I'm starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, within the context in which this debate takes place in is that minority communities are unable to find acceptance in society. They are locked up into their own echo chambers where majoritarian communities don't listen to them for numerous reasons, right? As I'll go on to explain. The key thing is that practices like hip hop, practices like the haka dance done by these players helps increase our acceptance in society because it reaches out to so many people. We're the side that wants to earn getting better outcomes for these minority communities. By better outcomes, we mean acceptance. That is why we are so proud to stand on opening government. A number of things I want to talk about. Firstly, on our stance, what do we mean by these cultural practices? These cultural practices are things like hip hop, things like the cultural food you serve, things like your music, right? Even practices like trophy hunting, or for Aboriginal people, things like boomeranging. We think the minority communities are talking about are communities like Black people, like Hispanic people, like Dalit people, who have been systematically locked out of these things. And so we think they should be able to propagate the tiki dance, the haka dance they're doing. What does OP have to defend? By protecting this culture, by protecting it from cultural appropriation, what they're supposed to defend is from preventing from propagating and from reaching more people. That is to say, they're not letting other people view it, charging big premiums, having small circles of people who view your culture, right? That's so stuff like hip hop bars in downtown New York or Chicago. That means you don't allow other people to come in and view your culture and or use it in their own use it in their own films or ideas, right? We think we're the side that still allows it to be acknowledged. We're not saying that people can do it and not acknowledge us. We think we should still acknowledge this practice we're doing comes from that minority group or comes from that culture. We just won't actively call them out when they do it, right? So we think they should still acknowledge us. So we want minority. So there are two more things to note here. Firstly, we want minority communities to allow members of their communities to sell things like minority relics if they choose to do so. We don't want advocacy groups to be condemning people who choose to be interested in minority culture. So like indigenous people in the USA, New Zealand, even African American people. Secondly, we don't think it's a debate about racism, right? Minority groups don't need to support people ridiculing their cultural practices. We think there's still some amount of respectfulness here. To win this debate, we could either show you why people deserve the right to go and use their culture in this manner, or we could show you how this massively increases acceptance in communities. And we're going to do both of those things in this speech. Okay, first I want to start about how we massively increase acceptance of these minority communities. I want to put you that the context in this debate is taking place in is that minority communities are massively isolated from society. Why? Because it's majority-owned media, which doesn't portray you in a favorable light, which doesn't listen to you, and which actually portrays you as weird or as people who don't deserve our sympathy or whatever. Secondly, the vast majority of people who are in power, the vast majority of people who are elected or who are in power are majorities, simply because there's vast amounts of voter disenfranchisement, simply because there's so much more money. Thirdly, they own the vast amount of capital in society. That is to say that big record label owners and big businessmen are in the majority of instances white people because they've accumulated this capital from so many years. Fourthly, because it's active gentrification. That is to say that we're stuck in ghettos and we're stuck in certain areas while members of majority communities live in different areas. Fifthly, we're shut out from things like textbook communities, school boards. This means that at the end of the day, we get stereotyped out. Asian people have no life, that Mexican people might be rapists or whatever in the worst instances, right? Or stuck in our own bubbles, or unable to speak out, we don't get sympathy. How does actually allowing us to have our cultural practices in popular media help us? So many reasons. Firstly, we help the majority of people view them as people with cultures and languages of their own, right? Previously, those people either weren't aware of their culture and might have whatever bigotry and stereotypes and conceptions they might have heard earlier. We think that at the point which we get mass acceptance in society, there's a point which they see us as people with our own culture. They respect us as an equal, as people who are not barbarians, as people who are not weird, but people who have their own culture, right? We think this humanizes us to them. A lot more people understand our culture. A lot more people acknowledge us, and we think that helps us fit into identity. The first and biggest benefit we get from this is currently we think that these people are incredibly even in things like schools, our children are incredibly stuck up. That is to say, they're stuck in echo chambers. So when a minority kid goes to a school, when a Black kid or Hispanic kid goes to school, you cannot fit in with people. You're seen as different. You're seen as not someone who conforms with so many other people, right? We think this means that you face bullying, means you face things like racism, things like microaggressions. We think that even in broader society, not just in schools, this is what happens with the vast majority of minority people. We think we increase the sorts of integration and relatability between various communities at the point at which we allow our culture to be this massively moderated. Secondly, We think when someone like Elvis Presley does or hip hop or whatever, we think so many more people are listening and care. The crucial context to note is because they have so many resources, they're the people who can actually increase the spread of our culture so much more. Right? It means that not only are given that so many more people are seeing this, we think we start the process of changing their minds. Like, this normalizes existence. There's so many more benefits beyond this. At the point at which you're getting attention for a cultural practice like hip hop or whatever, they're forced to listen when police violence is committed against. Right? Normally, these people, like majority communities, want to be aloof of criticism. They want to protect themselves. They want to see themselves as perfect. But when they see that the community with the practices was supporting is doing this, at the point they have to listen. These are so many impacts. Firstly, we get so much more political capital. Right? We think that huge amounts of political capital in society. We think that on our side of the house, political capital will be channeled towards protecting our existence and having the regulations which actually help us. Things like indigenous practices are actually disappearing today. I think we need things like government support. We need things like government funding. This is the first impact we give you. Secondly, we think we get mass amounts of international attention. At the point where a big record label is coming to a community and giving us this, like the support or like adopting our practices, that's when we're able to go beyond our bubble and go international. This means we have the support of the international community. We can get things like UNESCO acceptance. We can get things like other people coming in, investing in us, like coming to our communities, doing things like tourism. Thirdly, this means there's vast amount of media attention towards us. That is to say that when the atrocities committed against us, people want to come in and help us out. This means they're more likely to come in and do things like media reports. This means like we get much more acknowledged with history textbooks because people recognize us as our sort of community. The last benefit of this is simply money. We think that at the point at which like we normalize these practices, like people with capitalist incentives have an incentive to capitalize on this. This means that record labels start coming in. We think that minority artists are currently unable to grow. They don't have the money. They don't have the attention. This is an incredibly vulnerable group. We need to help because they're the people who actually propagate our culture. This is incredibly important because the impact of integration is that it helps a minority community in the long run. The principal idea I wanted to give you a quick thing on it. We think is that like it's their culture, it's their identity. From this community should have the right to go tell other people about it because it's their identity. They live it every day. It's their ancestry. It's their family heirlooms. We don't think it's right for the minority, for the minority community as a whole, to prevent individual people from going in and speaking out. At the end of the day, panel, what they only said that helps increase our integration in society. We normalize these minority communities. We get money, we get media attention, we get government support, and we also prove to you why it's a principle and moral obligation to allow these people to do it. That is why we are so proud to stand on opening government. Could someone just confirm you heard my speech?
I'm going to be doing two key things. One, I'm going to be going over the big ideas that they brought to you in their previous speech, and then I'm going to be bringing back our material, rebuilding on it from their attacks. So let's firstly deal with the big ideas that we got from them. The first idea we got from them is one that says this harms the authenticity of minority communities' culture, that it gets diluted. I have three responses. One, it's really, really unclear how showing a symbol of an arrowhead or performing the haka is something that dilutes the message of minority communities. When you're displaying a symbol of indigenous communities, you aren't diluting it. What you're doing is you're showing the rest of the world that it exists. But second, we think that if there is any instance where the dilution of messaging happens much worse, we think that it happens much, much worse on your side of the house. Why? Because if it isn't minority communities that majority communities are learning about culture from, then they're likely to learn about the culture of minority communities from people, from stereotypes that exist already in society. They're likely to learn about minority community from others who happen to know very little about it. We think that in a world where minority communities can actively advocate for cultural appropriation and allowing others to use their culture is a world where you take that culture from minority communities, you learn from there as opposed to majority communities, which means that there's more dilution on their side of the house because people would obviously still want to partake and still want to have an interest in minority community, but it happens from a far, far worse actor. But third, we're really, really unclear as to why this dilution in the first place even matters, right? Because at the point where minority communities are getting one, fame, getting two, money, and three, because of the fact that we're able to reduce in some ways or others racism to an extent. We think that it is a perfectly legitimate trade-off for individuals to make. We think that it's legitimate for you to choose to trade off some parts of your culture to get this money, to get this fame, to get this recognition. We think that that is legitimate. Given that, what was their second idea? They said that white people will gain credit of the culture, and everybody's going to be like, hey, this culture came from this white person as opposed to members of minority communities. I have two things. One, I think that people obviously do know where the haka came from. People do know where rap music came from. People know about this because they read textbooks already in society. But we think that in your world, the fundamental thing to remember is that no one even heard of the haka. No one even heard about the arrowhead symbol. No one even heard about any of the parts that really, really make indigenous communities special. The reason is because indigenous communities aren't displaying these symbols in fear that they could be culturally appropriated. They're keeping them to themselves. And we think that in that world, no one even has an idea of what they even are or whether they exist. That's your world. What about ours? In our world, at least we're able to show these symbols to many people. These people are able to learn about the actual culture of minority communities, and they can know that it came from them because of the fact that individuals obviously know that it has originated from them. But furthermore, even in the instances where, look, okay, people do think that this has come from another individual. We think that that ultimately sounds like an argument that says that, look, chess shouldn't, the game of chess shouldn't be played internationally because, you know, it came from India, but people don't know that it came from India, right? We think the fundamental thing to remember is that the ability for people to know that it exists far outweighs the harm of it being appropriated. But second, we actually think that white people aren't going to be taking things out of complete context, right? They're not going to be individuals who want to actively spread hateful messaging, right? So in the instances where they're incredibly diluting and they're taking something out of context entirely, maybe we don't need minority groups to actively call them out for that. But obviously members of majority communities themselves can say, hey, look, this is inauthentic. Hey, look, they're liars. They're not actually representing the minority community that I know, that I learn from textbooks, which means that obviously white people, when they're, carrying forth the culture that they've learned from minority communities, they're likely to represent that in a way that is authentic so that they can get people to pay to view that culture or pay to be part of that culture. The next thing we get from them is this argument that, consent isn't there, that minority communities just haven't consented, to having their culture being used by another individual. We think that this consent obviously exists on an individual level, right? So on the individual level, obviously people should be allowed to sell relics that symbolize their culture. People should be allowed to do things like allow people to tour their villages and allow others to do that if they so choose. We think that consent can obviously exist on an individual level. It doesn't need to be the entire community. The next thing we say, the next big claim that we get from them is this claim that says that, look, majority communities can make fun of minority communities' culture. I really just don't think that this is the case, right? Because our burden in this debate is not to support racism and actively, active hate against an individual's culture. Our burden is to prove to you why we think that it's legitimate for members of majority communities to use culture. No one's going to make fun of that culture. Before I move on, I'll take a POI if there's any from any team, preferably closing. Seeing none, we'll move on. What were the arguments that I brought to you? Two things. Well, we brought one, an argument on how we improve the inclusivity of minority communities of their nation. We said that the culture of white people in the United States is different than that of Native Americans. We told you that the culture of Arabian people in Israel is different than that of people who happen to be majority in Israel. We think that in those instances, the cultures are ultimately different and in many instances directly contradict each other. We think that if you're in those instances a minority member, it's incredibly hard for you to fit within the frameworks of your national identity. It's hard for you to integrate because a member of the other community is of a different culture and does not believe in yours. We think that in a world where a majority community embraces your culture, either because they think that it's fun or they think that it is interesting, you are more than willing to go and interact with them. When you see them using your symbols, they ultimately mean that ultimately means that they're interested. Their response was, look, there are other ways to integrate. the other ways to integrate is looking like dropping your own culture. But second, we help minority members, right? Like if you're Jay-Z, you're the best at rapping. Like white people just cannot get to the level of, African Americans when it comes to rap music, which means that if you're a minority community, you get the fame, you get the name, and you get the money, which we think ultimately helps you tangibly. It helps build interest in your culture. For all of these reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
Hello. Can you confirm if I'm audible?
Yeah, yes, you're audible.
All right, perfect. If to the chair, if I cut off at any point in time because my internet is really unstable, please just feel free to interrupt me and let me know that you can't hear me. And for POIs, I would just like it on chat. It would be really beneficial if you tell me what team it is so that I know who I'm seeing the POI from. All right. So
We have the member of CAF here.
Hi, I hope I can be seen and heard.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In closing government, we think that the calling out of cultural appropriation is an outdated defense mechanism that is holding back minority groups from a greater degree of integration and acceptance. We think this debate is very simply about what is in the best interest of minority, which approach to culture protects them more. So far in the opening exchange, we heard from OG that this is the best approach to increase acceptance, things like advocating for your culture towards the public sphere and things like that. It gives a lot of structural analysis on why minorities are disempowered to the extent opening up doesn't necessarily contend that minorities are disempowered. They instead say that the advocacy and spread of culture will further disempower minorities, locking them out from discussions and the financial benefits of their culture. If we can prove in CG two things, the first, that minorities to a large extent can still maintain ownership of their culture, even if they advocate for its spread, then we already overcome to a large extent all those harms about losing ownerships and financial benefits of that. But secondly, we are able to show that the value of culture, specifically towards minority groups, is not as great as they have seen, especially as how culture has evolved over time. Then we also tackle the other half of the debate, explaining why the trade-off then of increased acceptance is something that's likely to occur to a greater extent in the side of Gov. I'll just point out this one last thing about opening up with this debate, that insofar as they explain why the trade-off is something that's worse, they don't necessarily contest the benefits of improving perception and acceptance. So if we're able to disprove the harm, we think that government is already ahead of the op, and CEO needs to do a lot more work to carry this thing out. I will look at three things in the speech. Firstly, why minorities will still be able to maintain ownership. Secondly, why cultural evolution and integration has progressed to an extent that we just don't think people care that much about culture. Last, we're going to look at the alternative to attempting to maintain exclusive ownership, why it's unlikely to work and lead to a host of bad outcomes. Before that, first, let's make it very clear what cultural appropriation is. We really love the benefits from opening government. We just don't think cultural appropriation includes selling of souvenirs of trinkets relates to your culture. We think that's a very good example of things like you taking ownership of your particular culture. We think what cultural appropriation looks like in this particular debate is probably things like tourism, when you have foreign tourist companies coming into minority places and then setting up tourist agencies. Regardless of whether who owns this particular agency, we do think there are benefits to exposure towards minority culture, and that's something that's good. Also, things like with the Cheongsam incident where the white girl wore Cheongsam, instead of calling her out for cultural appropriation, just supporting her and saying that you value her, and you value the fact that she is promoting your culture. That's something that's good, and that's something that we think minorities should continue to fight for. First point, why do we think minorities still maintain ownership over the culture? The first thing to point out, that there's no reason no response in opening up towards opening gov explaining why minorities cannot continue to be a part of this discussion. We think that at the point that it's worse under that side, because at the point where you actively exclude yourself from the discussion and you attempt to exclude majority people from engaging in your particular culture, whether it be engaging in jazz or in rap or wearing dreadlocks or your cultural and more traditional clothes, that is the point where these people do not get involved in this particular discussion. We think that the way we advocate for increased cultural exposure means that necessarily minorities are kept in the loop as opposed to being antagonized as people that don't want to share the culture of other people. And that's why we still think we can be a part of this discussion. But more importantly, and over and beyond that, we do think there's a premium on authenticity. That means to say that the people who are the original creators or the original owners of this particular culture and art will have to a far extent a greater degree of say in that discussion, but more importantly, a greater quality with regards to the goods that they produce. We talk about, for example, the kek lapis in Malaysia, or like movies about indigenous people, or just minority artworks and styles, like things like embroidery, for instance. Like to the extent that white people can commercialize those things, like the kek lapis produced by companies just taste like shit, and that's why you need to go to those traditional cake makers in order to get those quality goods. What this means to say is, to a large extent, minorities can still maintain ownership over their culture because they just do it better, but more importantly, because they have prior ownership, they're likely to be able to shape those discussions in the ways that actually benefit them, but more importantly, maintain a degree of accuracy. Like Eminem, as much as he's considered rap god, always gives credits to his mentor, Dr. Dre, who is black, because of his like relevance to the culture. That's why we think minorities can still maintain ownership of their culture. Secondly, then, why do we think culture evolution integration has progressed to an extent that minorities should no longer isolate themselves in the name of cultural purity? OO says that culture is really significant for minorities in to minorities. In today's day and age, we don't think this is necessarily true. I'll take opening up after this point. There's just a lot of reasons why culture has evolved over the past few years. Things like interracial marriage means that people from different races have married and have children where people sort of have like shared and mixed heritage. Things like immigration, for example, things like Muslim from the third world often moved towards Europe and like formed their own enclaves and formed their own societies and coexisted between different types of like groups. Things like displacements of demographics, things like globalization, things like the westernization of values, colonialism. All these are mechanisms through which people around the world have been forced to uproot their lives and move around and coexist with other people. What this means to say is that the children of these people often interact with many people, with many different groups and many different forms of culture, and don't hold particular ownership only over any one form of culture. What this means to say is that the value of culture towards any particular group or any single person isn't as great as it was before in the past. We're happy to accept that in the past, cultural appropriation used to be a defense mechanism, especially against majorities that wanted to weaponize it. In today's day and age, that's not something that's true. We think culture has evolved over time and no longer holds as much significance as it is. That means to say that the harms of having your culture represented differently isn't necessarily something that impactful towards minority individuals right now. Like as a Chinese person watching a white person wear the cheongsam, is it something that important towards me or that hurtful towards my identity? And therefore we think that the values of acceptance should outweigh the values of the harm of like losing culture or losing cultural purity. I'll take OO.
Right. Even in under our world, you can have things like subbed films over like other languages, or minority-led events where the creators are minority who are directly benefiting of their own work. The problem is that the majority, when they appropriate this culture, they have more resources to interpret it in their own way, and the minority creators never end up getting the benefits of what they created. How is that defensible?
Just firstly empirically untrue. If you look at the way that minority movies are portrayed right now, minorities firstly have a great ability to call out like producers that aren't necessarily historically accurate. But like to the extent you claim your mechanisms is effective, I think that similarly happens on prop. So that's why minorities can still maintain a degree of control over like the sort of culture. The last thing I want to look at is why the alternative of attempting to maintain exclusive ownership of culture is likely to backfire. So to the extent that Op claims the majorities don't necessarily care about minorities, we don't think calling them out does anything to educate them about the value of culture if you claim culture is something that's so important towards your minority group. Rather, we think that the act of calling out is one that is antagonistic, but more importantly worsens the perception of minorities in the long run, because this is when people think this small group of people don't necessarily want to share their culture. This is when people don't make the attempt to empathize or to understand. That's the point where minorities are left worse off because there's less understanding about their culture. We think culture is likely to leak under both sides of the house. Cultural appropriations or accusations are going to fly on both sides. This is the best way to control the narrative and reclaim what was rightfully the minorities and bring the best interest towards them. Proud to propose.
Yeah, just give me 10 seconds. I'll
I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, they come here. Opening government comes and talks about how acceptance is the most important part of integrating the minority community back to society and make it more beneficial for them. And then closing government comes and talks about how minorities can still retain their ownership, and it's the best way to create any sort of positive change for the minority community is through this same sort of acceptance. But they rebutted the O's case of how they can still retain ownership. We as CEO, if we can prove to you that this sort of acceptance, what the OG and the CG claim, does not create any positive change on a scale, on a real world, and if we can show to you that this creates more harms than good, and other than that, if we use another alternative, it will be better for the minority group as a whole, we think CEO will clearly take this debate. First, we'll talk about acceptance, right? Sure, we'll take both of the government benches on the best case scenario. We'll accept that, what do you call the minority communities can still take ownership of whatever culture items they have, or whatever like rap music and some sort of dance and what do you call hip hop music, etc. If they can still take ownership, why is it still bad? Is when majority like the people and the people who are listening to such rap music, the problems highlighted by minorities communities and the people from majority who go ahead and take this sort of culture and make it their own and try to make stuff among in that cultural sphere, is at that point when the problems of this minority community are not highlighted enough, right? The problems which they are facing, like for example, in case of aboriginals in Australia, they do not have what do you call, they do not have the same rights as other citizens living there. But at a point of time in which other people go ahead and take their headgear and all, it's at that point of time in which the people who are like normal citizens, they go ahead and they think that if we go ahead and just like if we buy the culture, or probably listen to those rap songs, make rap music or something, we are going ahead and supporting their cause, we're going ahead and supporting whatever they stand for, we're going ahead and creating upliftment for them, which is wrong, right? Because they feel that their sense of inclusion with them, that they feel like, oh yeah, we are living in the same sort of shared experience with them. And it's at that point of time, it's very problem. I'll take you in the 5th minute. It's at that point of time, it's very problematic for the people, right? Because then it creates some sort of slacktivism where where people from the majority community who are taking part in this cultural sphere will go ahead and talk about issues which they know only through an understanding of what they have understood there, right? Instead of like how the dilution argument still stands, right? Because at the point of time in which you have majority content creators going ahead and talking about minority problems, they do not have the shared experience as them, and the people who are listening to this and who want to support out the minority communities will think that their support, their show of support, their show of like support for them, like how the OG came talk about international support, will be in some sort of buying headgear or buying some sort of artifacts from them. But instead their support should be in terms of the problems that they actually face, and this sort of slacktivism is very, very harmful. Then second thing which we exclusively bring from the side of CEO is the rise of identity politics, right? They come and talk to you about how this sort of creates a sort of political capital which allows them for to go ahead and advocate for change, etc., right? At a point of time in which you have political parties which go ahead and they use cultural appropriation. For example, in India, to woo the Bora voter base, some politicians go ahead and wear the Bora cap and sit with Bora Muslims for some time just to take photos of for PR event. It's at that point when these voters or people from the other community sees such a political party going ahead and using going and engaging with this culture, like how they spoke about how getting to know about the culture through use of like cultural activities such as wearing the Bora cap or probably involving in some Farsi rituals. It's at that point of time in which the whole narrative about the political system, right, like the changes which the minority community is trying to advocate for, probably better education for them, better housing for them, some sort of tax like some sort of loan despite for them, those are the changes which cannot be highlighted to the fore, because people now go ahead and vote political parties which go ahead and support these sort of culture appropriation, right? Like people from the like how, and political parties will also not have an incentive to go ahead and engage with such minority communities, because how we spoke about these majority voters are the main voter bank of these people, right? This sort of the change, this sort of legislative change which they talk about will not occur on the scale which is the minority communities want, right? The minority communities want like long but sustained change in which every problem of there is highlighted and what do you call addressed and changed, right? But instead now the political parties will be incentivized to go ahead and use some sort of small cultural appropriation, like how we spoke in the examples, to go ahead and get voters on their side of the house, and in order to go ahead in order to go ahead and win elections and get the support of such creators from the majority and people from the majority community with support who want to support this minority community, because for them now to support these minority communities will be a small act such as changing their fashion style or changing their hairstyle, etc. Before I complete, if there's a POI from opening, I will take it.
Yep. Today, there are vast amounts of whitewashing. People go abroad and forget their culture, and there's peer pressure to root for the latest Justin Bieber song instead of your folk song. As it is, the fact we're unable to gain profit by forming a culture. Why will these cultures not just fade away without government, majority, and foreign funding, which we're able to get?
Okay. To talk about that, yes. When we go ahead and talk about like small culture things such as like hip hop or probably like people going and whitewashing, it's at that point of time in which the major problem of the minority community, their problems like are very, very deep rooted, right? They do not get access to similar sort of education. A person from a minority community who has a different accent may not be go ahead and get the same job as a person with a proper American accent or something. Consideration for the job, same sort of consideration for a university seat, same sort of those are the problems they're trying to highlight. Those are the problems they're trying to fight, right? At a point of time in which they show that through acceptance and through to that these sort of problem they like we have showed you how this sort of narrative creates slacktivism, and which people supporting who want to support the minority community will be very easy opt out for them to just go ahead and support listen to rap music, or probably go ahead and buy listen to learn some sort of salsa dance to show that they're supporting them, and for political parties to go ahead and just use culture operation to get more voters rather than creating actual policy change for them. It's very problematic for the minority community as a whole, and this is why we think the CEO clearly take this debate very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much. Can we have the draft quit here?
Just give me a minute. Can I be heard? Can I be heard?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah.
All right, cool. We have tried defending our minority cultures via exclusionary methods for years, such as shutting down the privileged individuals who wear our traditional dress, cancelling actors for their box braids, but realize that while awareness has increased, a lot of this cultural usage has not stopped. The question now, as of this point, is whether or not we ought to stick with this strategy or move on to one that better culture finally and want to explore it, but are too afraid to do so due to the overarching antagonism that we have subjected all of them to as a blanket prior to this point. The first thing I want to do is to take down CO, because I think they had quite a minimal amount of extension that came out from their side of the house. The only extension they had was to say, via multiple examples, that engagement with one, I'm confused as to why politicians will suddenly stop supporting minorities if they have done so prior, just because a non-Asian speaks an Asian language or a Korean person is okay with a non-Korean wearing traditional dress. Two, if the claim is to say that legislative change won't be passed without achieving acceptance, realize that their side of the house further segregates communities in their world and disallows people from ever getting out of their bigoted heads, because we actively antagonize them away. Also, they disempower minorities' abilities to engage with these people and teach them the truth about their culture. Because realize, when it comes to cultural appropriation and the way in which we're defending it in the status quo, we rarely educate people about But three, towards the claim about people being complacent and listening to rap music to justify supporting black people, let's just acknowledge how shallow this line of understanding is. If you want to support black people truly, I think you would be like, it would be very clear to your normal human brain that listening to rap music doesn't necessarily mean you're supporting black people. But if you are a meanie and you are a bigot and you're listening to rap music to justify your bigotry and say this is enough to support black people, I think in a public sphere where rap music is normalized in the world as something that has cultural significance but can be accessed by people, that is the world in which these bigots are highlighted, and that is the world in which these bigots are actually educated about the right way to support these people. So in that regard, I don't necessarily think CEO has an opportunity to win this debate. The next thing I want to do is to take down OO under two additional characterizations will come out here as well. So the first issue is in regards to educating people. The claim from OO is to say that being able to reference cultures back to their communities is empowering and can only be done via defending ourselves against cultural appropriation. Actual communities can happen via two different ways. One, some cultures are quite easily associated with specific communities. Sushi and anime are clearly Japanese. Chinese New Year is clearly Chinese. While it is true that because of the amount of information that has been disseminated in society, not only by white people that is like perhaps misrepresentative, but also by our own communities that's a lot more representative about the specific nuances, demonizing people and calling them cultural appropriators. We have also spread enough information for people to be the extreme case where cultures cannot be traced back to existing cultures on communities on face value. I think education about cultural origins happens better in a world where people have an incentive to learn about those cultures, pushed away from exploring these cultures out of fear of antagonization, or are normalized to the presence of these cultures to begin with. That is why if you look at multi-racial and are well of us, because we're actually able to engage in those cultures. We're able to engage in, I don't know, celebrating Eid with our Malay friends or celebrating Chinese New Year with our Chinese friends, etc. Realize that there has been little comparative from opening opposition as to why education on them in exploring our culture and guiding them, especially considering the fact that they've actively dissociated themselves from our culture, puts an impetus on us culture in order to make sure that these harms that they wanted to talk about, essentially just people being dicks, doesn't happen. Secondly, in terms of the problem about asserting ownership, I have three responses to this particular line of argument. Firstly, realize a lot of cultural misappropriation and misuse. That is to say, just because a white man becomes a sushi chef, a black man speaks Chinese doesn't mean the language is any less Chinese. As stated earlier, I think people are aware enough to assess what a culture is. In that case, it is wrong to say that people lose their culture, and rather it's a lot more accurate to say their culture is misrepresented. And in that case, the question is then, how do we want to correct this misrepresentation? I don't think the answer is to shut out these people who are misrepresenting your culture out of discussion. I think it's to involve them, include them, and teach them what is right. Two, in a case where people do steal your culture and claim ownership over it, even though I don't really think that OO has sufficiently characterized to you what this necessarily looks like, realize that the problem is less of appropriation in general, in the general meaning of the word that society is aware of, where non-Chinese people wear cheongsams and it's cultural appropriation, and more of people just being inconsiderate assholes. In that case, the ability to educate these people to treat these cultures with respect is better in a world where people accept these cultures as present, but also in a world where they dissociate themselves from proper engagement. I'll take one from OO. Actually, CO, please. Okay, I'll just move on. So in that case, I think also know that minorities still benefit regardless of whether or not there's a premium of authenticity placed upon their cultural goods. That means the larger priority ought to be aimed at extending awareness and outreach of these cultures to greater parts of society. And in that regard, I think you have to allow these people to engage with your culture in order to be able to do this. But the third response to this that I have to say is I also control the discussions that occur on the ground about these cultural elements and in many ways people find meaning or choose to appreciate it. Considering cultural appropriation will still happen under both sides, regardless of which policy you choose, either out in the open or behind closed doors due to the fear of antagonization. I think at the very least, as a minority, you ought to be given control over discussions that occur in society. And the only way to do this is to allow your culture to be seen, heard, used, and accessed in order for you to be able to put out what necessarily is the best representation of your culture. The inability to do this often stems from the fact that people are just a lot like from that culture accessing different cultures, regardless of whether they do it right or wrong, because cultural appropriation has just extended will cancel you, pushing these people away from further awareness. And because of all those reasons, I think CG clearly takes this debate. Thank you.
Yeah, just give me 10 seconds. Panel, let me get some clarity into this debate, right? Basically, what metric should you actually use to judge this debate, right? I think the entire three houses keep talking about like whether cultural appropriation is it good or is it bad, or in terms of like whether this inclusivity will bring any sort of benefit, or whether dilution will or like whether this will dilute the message, right? I think a lot of unanswered questions from all the houses, right? Because if like let's take our government, right? If they keep coming and pushing that, their entire case is based on that, that people will get awareness, people will just know what is actually happening, and people will be included in this minority group, right? That is their entire premise of like their entire case, right, from both the houses. And our opening is just contingent about like cultural, and you shouldn't let go of that whole, right? So basically, I'll simplify the debate for you, right? What you judge on is that how it actually helps the minority group, right? Not in terms of like whether just like culture, like morally good, or like what is it, or is it just because like you get awareness so it's like good, right? Understand there's a lot of difference, right? I think all the spotlight and stuff, I think in even in general, minority groups are recognized, right? Black people are recognized. All of the things which they advocate, or even let's take the best case in terms of like they get more viewership in terms of like people knowing about these sort of people. We still you see Beyonce as a feminist icon, as a Black woman, and people are breaking out of the stereotypes and making a name for their own community, right? So what becomes important at this point is to see whether this sort of awareness, or this sort of spotlight actually dilute, it actually converts to something which is converts into something which is tangibly helpful for the minority group, right? Which no other house talks about. And that's why my first speaker is constructive in terms of like identity politics becomes the most important thing, right? See, what is the problem with everyone's case is that they keep coming and talking about like, people will have some sort of the government's case is that since you have some sort of awareness in terms of like these people exist, that means you're gonna get seen, accessed, or used, right? What we have a problem is that is the exact problem. You're kind of the narrative, or like the picture of your culture is based on like manga or like anime, right? The picture of your culture isn't based on like stuff which actually matters in terms of like your work hours, or even if you like take women in terms of like what the kind of domestic violence most women face in their in their households and stuff like that, right? And those are the exact problems which are actually more important to talk about, which are actually not heard even in all these instances, right? And understand that people generally are nice, right? If you come and say that like I am being oppressed, unless they like really are like really like horrible people in general, people will listen to you, right? What becomes important is to spread the right message, and the spreading of the message only happens when people actually sit down and listen to you, right? Why we believe that cultural inclusivity becomes a problem is at that point where we give this false illusion that just because you read manga, just because you wear the same hairstyle as me, or just because you opt into a certain painting of my culture, that means that you know my problems, right? That means you know my problems, right? And that is not true, right? The problem is that we want them to know the story of like how we're being oppressed. It's at that point where we can actually go forward and bring changes, right? When my first speaker comes and talks to you about a certain in terms of like parties catering to people in terms of like just wearing the same hair, wearing this cap, or like just having the same hairstyle as them, but what do we actually want is in terms of like policy changes, in terms of like what will actually help the minority groups, right? Minority groups themselves don't themselves feel that they're probably being included by the society, but the society does not really know the kind of problems which actually come, right? You don't know what your female friend is actually going at home, what sort of restrictions are being placed on her and stuff like that. That's the kind of narrative which we want to bring on the fourth hole, so that these people can get those changes, right? And why we think that does not happen on their side is because of this entire image that people are engaging with the culture, where they're just engaging with the face of the culture, but not actually the depth of it, right? So it's at that point where we believe that where we want this to happen, right? Sure, they can come and talk to you about like how rap culture or like stuff like this propagates the message and stuff, but I think only the top 1% or like the cream layer 1% are the people who are recognized from this, right? The real people's problems who are actually oppressed aren't being faced. The problems which are brought by these people are very shallow, right? So it's at that point where we think that this sort of happens, and the second question comes to whether people will still listen to us and stuff like that, right? Because understand, we agree that some sort of cultural inclusion brings some sort of like people are more the kind of barrier or resistance faced is less, right? But we believe that in terms of like people's nature, and it's been like successful in the previously, right? Just because you're not a lesbian does not mean you don't advocate for the for the LGBTQ movement, right? Or if you're probably just like people who want this change, right? Because people believe in actually advocating for the problems of which for the oppression people face, right? So it's at that point where we still think that we can know that Black people have been oppressed, where people know women have been oppressed and stuff like that. What we need to do further is to spread the right message and to actually go forward and actually help these people, right? Even if let's take their best case that the kind of message being spread is in terms of like just being culturally just in terms of like being acceptable in terms of like fashion sense and all that stuff, I think that can happen regardless of this, right? Where people admire, where people actually go ahead and listen to rap music, because people find some sort of importance in it, right? And a very very realistic turn to this is that when you actually apply for a job interview, people believe that where if like let's say if your culture values are diluted in terms of everyone believes that everyone can do it, or if people don't get the nuance of how what is the story behind it, then people won't favor you, because like people still believe that what you can do is something other people do, and where we think that culture brings some sort of importance in terms of giving new ideas and nuanced opinions, which only rises if you're part of that culture. So it's at that point where we believe they'll still see that when they're hiring you, they'll still prefer you because they know that what you can do or what your story is not something compatible with what a white person or a normal person can do. So for all these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
All right, thank you everyone for their speeches. Can I get you guys to leave the breakout room for a bit? OCG is so much for the debate. It's quite good actually. So the rankings are as follows: closing Gulf coming in first, and opening opposition coming in second, third opening Gulf, and last closing opposition. The panel actually was came to a split decision with regard to the opening half exchange specific. Sorry, not opening half, but a short cross exchange specifically. So one of the panelists felt that the closing government came second to the opening opposition, but the majority of the panel thought otherwise. So let's first go on into explaining why closing op comes in last. So closing opposition, the reason why you guys come below the opening government specifically in the long cross exchange is because while you guys in constructive material try to push out the idea that politicians are very politically opportunistic and they are willing to use cultural appropriation as a means to kind of prey on the minority vote, all these things are quite unresponsive or uncomparative to what the OG sets up as a mechanism, right? What mechanisms do they set up? They set up the mechanism of having normalization, of having humanizing processes, because the participation in minority cultural practices by the majority will mean that they're able to fit in other spaces, because cultural, basically being able to have widespread use of their culture means that they have more common ground through culture, and all those things constitute this whole humanization mechanism that they have. And a lot of the impacts that they then have from there, like the political capital being increased into like trying to protect minority groups and disappearing indigenous practices, for example, all are explanations of how politicians also, right, implicit explanations of how politicians are also likely to not treat them terribly. So the question then, right, is that if you want to run this particular argument, you need to first disprove this mechanism that the OG does and explain why it is more likely on your side, because you're a closing team in the room, and tell the judge why in comparison we think that it is more likely that politicians are going to see them as political tools and the humanization effect doesn't work. Because for what you guys are saying that basically they're going to be used as political tools for politicians to achieve their ends. That itself kind of clashes implicitly with the idea of the opening government's whole point about humanization, and I think you guys need to weigh out which is more likely. And because you guys are the closing op team and you guys don't do this, I think it's not fair for us to put you guys above the opening government on this particular front on the first level. But the second thing is that I don't think that you guys and here's why you guys come in forth with respect to the closing government. So I'm going to discuss the closing half exchange first. So I think what you guys don't do is sufficiently push out why the ownership point that the closing government is pushing is not true or is weak. I don't understand the responses, the response directions in terms of like trying to discuss the skirting around of like pictures of culture, people visualizing culture as just anime and manga and things like that. Those responses, I think, kind of missed the mark for the closing government. What needed to be responded to from the closing government were their important extensions. I think there were like two or three things that they were trying to push out. I think they first tried to position themselves as a team that wants to move beyond the whole call out culture that has been happening right now, and that they want to move towards a context whereby we are able to really have that kind of intermixing, and we want to have that kind of ability to control the discussion, because now perimeters have been very clearly drawn up because of call out culture and because we are at this stage of time, this tipping point, we want to do these things. I think there was a contextualization on that front that was not challenged at all by the closing opposition. Subsequently, a lot of the argumentation coming up from the closing government just doesn't get any clear response as well. So things like, for example, how ownership continues for the minority, things like that. I think, especially the idea of premium and authenticity, I think those were things that were unresponded to, that actually was quite important, because opening opposition made a huge case that was largely premised on the fear of losing ownership and the fear of diluting that particular culture. So I think closing opposition does very little to respond to any of these things. And as a result, they lose the closing half exchange as well. The reason why closing opposition loses out to the opening opposition also is because closing opposition kind of just like doesn't actively differentiate themselves in a way that's meaningful. So but telling me that that politicians specifically are telling us that politicians are going to be opportunistic and stuff like that tells me that tells me that policy making, or not policy making, but like politicking behavior is very undesirable. But I'm not sure why any of those things are more important than what the opening opposition pushes out as harms to that community that I think are a lot more well substantiated in comparison to the rigor that was put in for the closing opposition. So closing opposition's way of justifying their extension was talking about a lot of examples of how like political opportunism exists on cultural minorities. But I think what opening opposition does better in terms of constructive material with respect to the burden of the opposition in this debate is that they are able to argue in a way that is generalized across the spectrum for cultural minorities. And and I think that their contribution in this debate with respect to closing opposition is that they are able to set out a major challenge to the Gov bench in terms of what it means to like lose control and have dilution and loss of ownership. I think those things were very central arguments, and I don't think that closing opposition sufficiently differentiated themselves in a way to explain why their contribution mattered more than that contribution on loss of control and ownership and dilution. So third, why OG comes third? OG, I've kind of explained why CO, you guys win the long cross exchange, but why do you guys lose the opening half exchange to the OO? The reason why you guys lose the opening up is because while you guys are right in pointing out that people are going to do this at the end of the day, people are just still going to try to partake in culture, and the problem is that they may do it in prejudicial ways. I think what the opening up does really well in this debate is to explain and analyze the loss of ownership and why that is likely. And I think what happens is that they also subsequently in DLO make a really strong argument about why ownership is so crucial to them and their identities and things like that. So what I think happens in the opening up exchange is that while you guys tell me really important impacts and tell me a very important mechanism of like humanizing and normalizing them, I'm not sure why that normalization and that humanization is necessarily going to be the case when LO comes up and explains that it is actually very likely that you have dilution and all those things. The only response we get from DPM on this is that even if dilution happens, it's worse on their side because the majority will learn from the stereotypes on their side. But like the response obviously from them is that they'll call them, from the opposition is that we call those things out. But the other response that we get from DPM, right, is that how will showing an arrowhead or displaying a symbol dilute this? And I think that's a bit of a convenient response that is largely a rhetorical question at the end of the day. I would suggest that in the opening exchange on the issue of like whether or not there's going to be dilution and loss of control, I don't think opening government has a very clear answer to the opening ops claims on this particular issue. The reason why then opening government comes below the closing government is because I think closing government takes the higher burden in explaining and clashing very clearly with the opening opposition on the issue of ownership. And I think on the issue of ownership, what they do better than you guys is that they explain specifically why it is more likely that the majority isn't going to alienate and exclude those particular individuals outside of the culture, right? So it's just very unclear why, for example, like the sushi chef, people are going to mistake this particular sushi, the white person making sushi and thinking that the whole culture is belonging to the sushi people. But also, like, more importantly, they're not going to like exclude Japanese chefs, I guess, from this particular thing, from this particular process of like authenticity and cultural exchange. So it's just very unclear why you guys come below. It's unclear why you guys have any like mechanism beyond the mechanism of humanization. But again, this humanization and this whole like idea of normalization is contingent on you being able to control the narrative. And what I think CG does is that they prove that this particular ownership can exist, it will exist, and is more likely to exist. And that's the reason why it kind of completes a gaping kind of hole in the opening Gov's case with respect to the whole like humanization and normalization mechanism, which, like I said, is predicated on you proving that people are able to maintain some sort of control over their cultural identity and cultural practices and the spread of it. So why is it that OO comes below the CG? Yeah, so the short cross exchange was quite dynamic here. I think that there were a couple of things that OO. First, I think was the ownership thing. But the second thing is also just the idea of profit, and the third thing is that there's historical baggage and things like that. However, I would like to point out that like the idea of profits, going back to them, is in fact linked was to strategically position their extension as being a direct kind of it's a direct, they could prove ownership was a thing and that could exist on their side. That a lot of the harm that does your trade-off, the trade-off that OO wants, then would be invalid, right? So I think on the profits and all that are subsets of the whole idea of, was not argued in a way that moved beyond like historical injustice. I was very unclear as to why, if there was historical injustice, why is it that we could not allow for them to participate now, especially after co-op culture has kind of put out there that, you know, these things are bad. There were things in the past that were terrible. You guys need, and like what CG points out, that they set out cultural perimeters for them now, right? Because contextualization, I think, kind of displaces the entire idea that the idea of historical baggage also is largely linked to the idea that if you do this, you will also lose ownership over it to like your neo-colonialists, I guess. But like I guess this is also something that is predicated on ownership. And I think what they do in the closing government is to use is to use this idea of like ownership and flip it and explain why that's not something that's going to be a huge issue as well. I think the other things is that I think they are right in CG in terms of engagement to point out very clearly that clearly like it isn't that people cannot tell, like, it's not cultural loss that's something that's going to be happening. I think what they try to shift the debate towards is talking about cultural appropriation in the context of cultural misrepresentation. And I think they justify this particular pivot quite well by talking about it in with some contemporary analysis on why that's necessarily true. And what they do is then explain the blueprint for why they are able to kind of correct and rectify for that particular disparity in misrepresentation and correct representation by talking about how like they are able to have creative license and cultural license as an ethnic minority group to be part of that particular process in spreading the use of their culture. So it is because of those reasons, I think like you get the CG comes above the opening opposition as well. All right, so that's the reasons. Yeah, that's all.